Okay, so in this video, we want to talk about the Vellum post process or Vellum post process. I'm not sure how to pronounce it correctly. I call it Vellum post process, but maybe my pronunciation is wrong. The idea behind, as the name suggests, is it's doing something to your simulation after you simulated it. And usually it's actually part of every simulation because it does a couple of things that you probably need when you work with cloth or something like that. So it does a couple of things. So let's go through the most important ones one by one. The first thing is that you can actually use it just like your Vellum solver to visualize certain things after you've simulated them. So for example, I have our example from before here, our sphere that just crashes through our welded piece of cloth, and then it all breaks apart. There you go. And what I might want to see afterwards are the stress factors that resulted in breaking the weld. Or actually, maybe I want to see the weld constraints where they were and all that kind of stuff that I had access to in the Vellum solver under Visualize. And actually everything that you find here under Visualize in the Vellum solver, you also find in the Vellum post process. Always make sure that you connect everything for it to work correctly. And under Visualize, the second one, you can show, for example, the thickness that your simulation had even after it's cached, or maybe you can show where the welds were. As you can see here, if you look closely, there you can see it, where the welds are, or maybe, and you can increase the radius scale, maybe that's a good idea, there you go. Then you can show where the pin to target constraints were. You can show where the stitch point constraints were and all that other stuff as well. Then you can also show the false color mode. Remember where you can show the stretch stress, for example. There you go. So you can still analyze afterwards what actually happened here. So this can be handy. I don't want to go further into this. This is something we already talked about. And you can do this now after you cached it. More interesting is under operations, what you can do here. Let's start with the subdivision. So as the name suggests, you can actually subdivide your geometry. And as you can see here, you can make it finer and softer on the edges as well. So maybe, I don't know, the edges here, as you can see before that, they looked like this, pretty hard edges. And now after the subdivision, they are soft. So great. You might think, well, I can do this myself with a simple subdivide. And at first glance, you're right, you can subdivide it obviously with the same algorithms. But when you go to the first frame and look at the result, you can see actually that's not true, because now it subdivides each piece separately. You will get those little smoothed edges where you can see where the breaks will happen. This is something the Vellum post process is not doing. And let's quickly turn off the visualization. Yeah, and as you can see, there are no holes in it when you use the Vellum post process instead. And let's make sure we have the same number so that the comparison is fair. And here you can see same result in the subdivision, but different results in the holes. So now you might say, okay, well, I know how to fix that. I just used the open subdiv by linear so that it doesn't smooth the edges. And at first glance, it might look correct. But then when you look at a later frame, maybe this one, you can see that, first of all, it looks kind of wonky. The normals are kind of broken, but let's ignore this for now. We can see that the edges, of course, when we use open subdiv by linear are not soft, whereas the Vellum post process actually makes sure that when the pieces are separating, they will be soft. They will just not be soft when they are next to each other, so that you can't see where the breaking is happening. So let's look for another example, maybe this one here. So this is with the Vellum post process, and this is with a subdivide set to open subdiv by linear. So this is why it makes sense to use the Vellum post process here. Another example of this, another thing that is automatically already added is this up here, the apply welds. And this is something we didn't have to think about, but this actually makes sure that if we would render this, that we don't see where the breaks are. So for example, if we look at the actual cached simulation and we look at a later frame, you might have noticed before that once it deforms, you can actually see where the breaking happened. And this is because here technically we have multiple points and therefore multiple normals. So here you can see that. Let me quickly fix the length of the normals. There you go. Because what's happening here is those pieces are actually separate. Maybe an exploded view can show us that. Those are actually separate pieces, and therefore at this point here, there are 2 points with different normals, and this is why I can actually see where the break is happening. Now, this is something the Vellum post process is fixing automatically by finding those pieces, and even without the subdivision, making sure that those points that are part of the weld will have the same normal, and then these weird visible breakups are gone. So this is something that happens automatic, but also helps with the final look, especially with welds. Now we'll talk about the spatial blur in a second, but for now let's skip that and talk about the thickness. So thicken at the very bottom, as you might guess, just thickens our geometry, and sorry for the weird viewport problems with the lighting. That's just how Houdini is. It has a horrible viewport, as we know. So here you can see it thickens my cloth, which of course makes sense. Maybe we don't need that much, but a little bit of thickening of course makes sense for certain materials like leather or something, and even for cloth it makes it look a bit more believable. Now again, you might think, well, I don't need a Vellum post process for this. I can just use a normal poly extrude. And as soon as you try that, you will see it doesn't really work. If I try a number like 001 or maybe 0005, there you go. The problem is it extrudes now each piece separately, and instantly you can see that there are different pieces that are glued together. So this is not working, but the Vellum post process of course takes care of this. Well, let's say you know a fix for this, maybe a normal node, but still you would have now the problem that you can see where the extrusion is happening, because even the direction of the extrusion is not really helping here in hiding those cracks. So again, Vellum post process is a pretty good idea for thickening as well. And then the next thing is softening or blurring. And for this, we switch to another example because it's better suited for that. And that is this here. We have here a barrel and some cloth that just falls on that barrel. Nothing too crazy. And this is already cached, and let's give it maybe a nicer color, a little bit of red maybe. And then it looks something like this. All right. Now this is nice and was a pretty fast simulation, but you see a couple of problems. So here, for example, you have, because of the resolution, maybe the thickness is too high or something, or maybe my substeps were too low. You can see that you can clearly see this weird crumbling happening, which is not really appealing. So what we can do here, of course, again, is the Vellum post process, which will help us with other things as well. For example, we could subdivide, but also we can blur the whole thing. And at first, you can see that it will not solve every problem, but it will soften it to an extent and make those edges that look a little bit, there you can see, they might look sometimes a little bit too hard, and with too hard edges, you can just blur this away. Now this is nice and all, it makes it look softer, but the problem is when you look at it in combination with the actual barrel, then you can see that you blur it away in a way that it goes through the barrel. Now this would be the same when you use a smooth or an attribute blur. You would run into the exact same problem. So a smooth would smooth it as well, but it will not recognize the underlying barrel and it will look wrong, and an attribute blur will do the same. There you go. So you can see it seems to have the same problems as the rest. Now, this is actually where the Vellum post process is made to solve this problem. If you make sure that the third input is actually the collision object. Now, for some reason, I've noticed that if you cache your geometry with the Vellum IO, that out of the collision output, there is no barrel, even though it actually went in. I'm not sure why that is. That might be a bug. But what I would recommend here is just always make sure that what goes in here into the third input, the collision geometry, is actually the collision geometry. So always check if you actually get it in. An easy way, because in this case it's just a static object, we just take the original barrel as a collision input. And the cool thing now is when you use the Vellum post process and look at it with a combination with the barrel, the smoothing will take the underlying barrel into account. Doesn't look like it just yet, and that is because to make this work we have to first turn on the detangle, and it actually explains that to you. The smooth and subdividing may introduce collisions. Detangling moves points to avoid such introduced collisions. So if you use spatial blur or subdivision and you move through your collision geometry, make sure your collision geometry is a third input and then turn on detangle. And what you can see here is now that the smoothing will never penetrate the barrel, no matter how high you push it. And the same is true for the subdivision. And it's even so cool that if you really crank this up a lot, that you can see how the shape of the underlying barrel shines through the shape of the simulation. So of course, this is a bit time consuming, this whole process, but if you play blast this out, it looks a little bit like silk almost. Now, of course, this might not always be what you want, but you can see the concept quite well here. Now, sometimes this might not work. It depends on the resolution and the substeps. So maybe this is not solving your problem. But sometimes if your geometry is just a little bit too edgy and you need to smooth it just a bit, then the Vellum post-process can be a great solution, because with the detangled option turned on, it can take the collision geometry into account. One thing to keep in mind about the detangle function though, I mean, if you go over it with a mouse, it tells you what it's made for. It's made for using it in combination with a subdivision and spatial blur. But some people think, and to be fair, I thought so as well in the beginning, that you can use this to kind of fix your simulations. This is not the case. So if you have something where you have some actual entangling, so maybe something like this, which is a pretty mean simulation. And it's actually pretty hard to bring Vellum to create intersections with itself. But here I managed to do it. Here you can see that the pieces go through each other. Now let's quickly try if we can solve this with the Vellum post-process. And we connect everything. And still, no matter how often we run the passes, even if it's 100 times and we play around with the thickness, it will not work. So just to be clear, this is not what it seems to be doing. And even if it would work, keep in mind that this still only works on a single frame. So every single frame of your simulation would have slightly different results, and it would probably result in some kind of jittering, because then the results will not be consistent. So do not rely on detangling with this node, because it simply doesn't work. This is a simulation problem and you should solve it there. The Vellum post process is more meant for, making your already good simulation look nicer for rendering. It's not really there to solve any kind of simulation problems. So yeah, that's Vellum post-process. It's mainly meant to make sure that your geometry looks good before you render it after the simulation, and it usually takes care of thickening up your geometry, keeping everything looking like in one piece. The weld is a very good example of where you need that, because by default it makes sure that the normals are calculated in a way that the object seems to be intact. Then you can subdivide it, which works better than doing it manually, and the same is true for blurring. And you can even turn on detangle in combination with a collision geometry, like in our barrel example here. And then it makes sure that when softening the geometry, like here, it will actually take the underlying collision object into account, which will give you much better results than trying to do it yourself with a smooth or attribute blur. And this is exactly the point of this node. So yeah, that's Vellum post-process. The nice thing is you don't risk anything by using it, because it will always happen after your simulation. Ideally, I would say do it after the caching, not before, so that you can always change it. I hope this is helpful and will help you making your simulations a bit nicer before you render that. So thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.